Trial master files are often a complex and head-scratching affair, especially when it comes to trying to figure out how you document issues and deviations from your process. In today's session, we're going to tackle the exception that's become the rule, note to files. We're going to cover the do's and don'ts of writing note to files, as well as how to build an ironclad process that actually builds confidence in an inspection and doesn't reduce it. State of TMF is officially in session. Let's get into it. All right, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the State of TMF. We're incredibly excited to have you all here for this first event. As a reminder to everybody, this is a brand new live event and podcast coming from Montreal. Every other Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. You'll be able to attend live, ask questions, engage with our lovely hosts that we have. Each session will be focusing on a different topic, and it's really designed to give back to our community, give better education, more knowledge, get insights on how to improve inspection readiness, identify and scale optimization programs, train your team to operate at scale, and of course, understand what it takes to create a world-class TMF program. As a reminder to everybody, of course, for those that are unable to attend today, or if you wanted to listen to this event again, it will be available on all major streaming platforms for podcasts, and so you'll see a link to all of that at the end, so you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, and all of those things, as well as the full video episode on YouTube. So today we're going to be focusing on an incredibly well talked about topic, and probably a pain for most, which is everything to do with note to files. A really critical look at what we think started as the exception, but ultimately became the rule. And we're going to help you try and understand what you should and shouldn't be doing when it comes to notes to file, and how to put in place a strategy and a process for better managing notes to file in your TMF program today. Now, the State of TMF is going to be hosted by a number of different individuals, including myself. For those that aren't aware of who I am, my name is Oliver Pierce. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing here at Montreal, and have spent the better part of a decade within the TMF community in the TMF world. So I'm incredibly honored to be here with everybody today. I'm also joined by my colleagues, Kathy Bedia and Donatella. Maybe Kathy, Donatella, you can introduce yourselves. Kathy, I'll throw it to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Oliver. I'm Kathy Bedia. I'm the head of solutions consulting here at Montreal for close to 6 months now. I do come from the world of clinical research, having spent close to just about 20 out of my 30 years in the industry dedicated to TMF at both CRO and sponsor level. And note to files have always been a hot topic right from the beginning. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Donatella Ballerini. My background is in clinical development. Now it's almost 15 years, and that makes me feel very old. So, but anyway, my big passion. So my big passion for TMF took me to Montreal in 2021, where I became head of TMF services. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I wanted to thank Oliver and the rest of the team for having this big idea and big project of a podcast of a TMF, which I think it will really fill some gaps in the industry and give you some very helpful insight to our audience. So thank you again, Oliver, and the rest of the team.
Yes, thanks,
You're
Oliver.
absolutely welcome. You're welcome. The chat is now open, so if everybody if anybody wants to ask any questions throughout today's session, you can do so. For those that are attending live, of course, we'll try and answer questions throughout, so throw them at us as they come to you, and I will be directing them at our wonderful subject matter experts today. So let's get into the subject of the session today, which again is titled Confessions of an Ex-TMF Manager, Breaking Bad Habits with Note to Files. So let's start by trying to look a little bit about, trying to zero in a little bit more on what is a note to file and ultimately what its original purpose is. So Donatella, I'm going to throw this to you first. Could you give us a bit of a rundown on from your perspective, what a note to file is?
So I'm not spending lots of time explaining you the definition of a note to file. I think that everyone who is on this call know what a note to file is. The point is that, in my opinion and in my experience, I really think that a note to file is a double sword edge. It can be a good practice, but it can be also a very bad practice. So it depends, as almost all the tools that we have for TMF management or for documentation management in general, it depends on the use that you do and how you develop the process for managing it. So I think that the best definition for a note to file is that a very risky practice, because if you don't know how to use them in the proper way, you will fail and you will have lots of issue during inspection or an audit. So I think that this sentence from this very interesting article, that we use this article also in our training, because I think it's very helpful, and lots of insight in this article define really well the sense of a note to file. So a common document when used properly, a note to file can be a positive practice. So again, I'm not saying that is a bad practice at all, but some in the clinical trials community, however, seem to think a note to file is a panacea for all things that have gone wrong. So very often people just think that a note to file is the solution to all your clinical trial issue. Is not. And we will see in the next slides why it's wrong to consider the note to file as a panacea for all your issue.
And I guess, it's sort of become like I mentioned at the beginning, it's sort of become this sort of, okay, if there's an issue or if we make a mistake, just write a note to file, right? And that can obviously present some issues, right, Kathy? I mean, what comes to mind on your end there?
Yeah, and absolutely right, Donatella. It's hard to navigate those note to files, when to use, when not to use, when it's a benefit and when it's a detriment. I always like to say that I've seen 3 common uses of a note to file: overuse, misuse, and abuse. and we can come up with plenty of examples for each. But yeah, I think what's really important to note here, and you guys touched on that, is that, those uses or misuses of a note to file are often the result of sort of a misguided way of thinking about note to files, and that they're often viewed as, this safety net or this free pass to commit non-compliances or deviations. So oftentimes there'll be this thought process that I've witnessed, that goes something like, well, it'll be really difficult to perform that task or collect that missing document because of reasons XYZ. So instead of performing our due diligence to mitigate that problem, we'll just go ahead and plan to not comply with that process or deviate from our protocol, and it'll be fine. We'll just write a note to file. So I think that the common thought is that as long as there's transparency and admission of a deviation, that it'll satisfy an inspector. And while transparency is always a good thing, it's really not the sole purpose of a note to file, and it's not going to negate your non-compliance. So I think there needs to be that change in the mindset in those cases, and that can be the first step toward improving your issues of note to file misuse.
I love that. Okay, that's so when we think about the like you said, the use, misuse, overuse side of things, I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about maybe when is a note to file appropriate, right? And so from your perspective, Donatella, when we're advising customers on how to put in place a process and a strategy for note to files, what are the recommendations that you typically make for when a note to file is appropriate to use, and when would you recommend using a note to file?
So regarding this question, I think that I can bring some of real example during my experience. So definitely you can use note to file when you need to document and give an explanation of an issues that can be solved. So basically where there's a big issue in the protocol management, the clinical trial management that can be solved. And again, if all the other options were checked and are not, you can't follow them, you can use a note to file to explain the issue and what you did try to solve the issue, to mitigate the issue. Otherwise, you can also use a note to file, try to add information or better clarify some exception of your clinical trial management, because basically we've got all our standard operating procedure, all our rules, all our regulatory requirements to follow when we are managing the clinical trial. But sometimes there are exceptions. We know that each trial is different. Each trial has a specific study design. Each trial is unique. So there will be always some exception now, especially now that trials are really becoming global. So whenever there is an exception that you want to capture and that you want better explain in case of an audit or an inspection, or even just for internal knowledge to the study team, you can use note to file. Another one is when you need to clarify or express site-specific requirement. Again, more and more now we are doing and managing multi-site trial. So it will be the case that some of the sites, or even just one site, have some specific requirement, maybe in their specific procedure. For example, I don't know, something related to the labeling of the drug, to the storage of the drug, to the dispensing of the drug. So there will be maybe some specific site-specific requirement, and you're not going to write an SOP or a working instruction to capture it, but you can use a note to file to keep track of this information. That will be helpful when you do your health check, when you do your oversight of the TMF, and when you try to reconstruct the story of your trial master file. Or you can also use a note to file to document some very specific regulatory requirement. Let me tell you this, what happened to me. It was the beginning of the COVID, and everyone, we were all at home, obviously working from home, luckily. Luckily we just implemented, when I was working at the sponsor side, something like 3 months before the COVID, the electronic signature. So we were, let's say, lucky that we just used the electronic signature to sign documentation that were necessary for the submission of a trial. But we receive a strange but real request from a competent authority to have a letter of indemnification signed manually. They didn't accept the electronic signature, even if we were in a pandemic situation, in a pandemic moment, and even if our validated, our electronic signature was a validated one. So, I mean, it was in compliance with the requirement, but they didn't accept it. They just want a wet ink signature, and it was a multi-country trial, so the other country were all accepted the electronic signature. So imagine at the eye of an inspector that check the documentation and see that all the letters are signed electronically, just one is signed wet ink. Why? Maybe the system was not working, maybe what's the problem here? So this is a specific regulatory requirement. So for someone that come and try to rebuild the story, I think it's necessary to know that it was a requirement for the competent authority to have that particular document signed in wet ink. And this is why, let's say, it's different from the other document of the submission package. So all these examples try to make you understand that note to file, again, can be used in a positive way when they add clarification, when they add information, when there is something that is not standard and you need to clarify somewhere, and obviously that reason is not captured in another document. And I think that Kathy has some really good example to explain that note to file is not the only tool that you have when you need to capture this exception, this particularity of clinical trial. There are other tools that you can use and that they are more appropriate.
That's such a good point. And I think that's the idea, right? Is that, we're not saying here that note to files shouldn't be used at all, but they should be used in certain cases. And then, to go back to your point earlier, Kathy, about sort of the misuse of note to files, I think sometimes, maybe study teams or TMF groups aren't aware that maybe a note to file isn't appropriate and could be, that information that's contained in that note to file could actually be documented in the source document itself, right? So, for those that are joining us on the live stream, you'll see a list of a couple different common notes to file, and where, we would recommend trying to document that information. Kathy, from your perspective, when would you try and avoid using a note to file and really try and prioritize, including that information in some of the source documentation? Could you give us maybe a couple examples?
Yeah, well, just before I go into that, it's really important to understand that, like we're saying, note to files aren't necessarily bad, but when you have an overuse or an abundance of note to files, you should try and avoid writing note to files if possible when it's really not that appropriate or not as necessary. The more you have, the more cans of worms you're opening up, the more an inspector will dig deeper into why you have all these note to files. So, there are a lot of common issues that come up during a trial, right? Nothing ever runs perfectly without any hiccups. And I'm sure if you speak to an inspector, they'll have a grocery list of common issues that they encounter during an inspection as they relate to note to files. But what's important is how the organization deals with them. So common practices we've seen is when a note to file, like Donatella mentioned, will be written to address an issue, and in fact, it could have been dealt with in the source documentation. Maybe it's not necessarily a non-compliance as such, but just maybe an explanation as to why, a certain process was performed as opposed to another, or whatever. So these are examples of some of these issues that can come up. So for example, if there's follow-up action between an investigator and a sponsor after the last monitoring visit, this could maybe be documented in the actual monitoring visit instead of creating a note to file. Or an issue having to do with the delegation of responsibilities of the site staff. This too could be addressed perhaps on the delegation log itself. Writing a note to file to document when a specific document isn't really applicable to the TMF, or documenting a decision that was made over email. These could have been addressed in the TMF management plan and the filing of correspondence respectively. And now what I've also seen is, when the documenting of a specific issue is indeed in the source document, but then a note to file is written as well on top of that. So they're like, doubling up there. So this is an overstating of the obvious. It's a bit of an overkill, with the thinking that more is better. We've really covered all our bases, but more is not always better.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely love that. And the chat on the live stream here is going absolutely wild. So I absolutely love it. Okay, so we now have a better understanding, I think, of when a note to file is appropriate to use, and maybe some easy, quick wins, some tactics that TMFers can really use to include some of the information that they might have written in a note to file in existing source documentation. And again, you hit on something that was really important there, Kathy, I think, which, we have this assumption sometimes that more is better. And obviously we have the adage here, less is more. And I think in this case, sometimes more can be confusing. And it shows potentially to an inspector that maybe there's some issues here that you need to dive into in a little bit more detail. So let's move on. What I'd love to dive into now is sort of looking at when to write a note to file and when not to write a note to file. So if you decided, okay, I think I need one here, but I'm not really sure where to focus. Kathy, what should we not be doing when it comes to notes to files, and when should we not be writing them?
Right. So there's sort of, a little mental checklist that, you should kind of go through. So the main one being, which I think encompasses a lot here, when there's no added value. I've seen that a lot, where note to files will be written where they simply point out, what the discrepancy is or the non-compliance is, like, signature missing, the end. I mean, an inspector can see that on the document in question. So, that note to file has no real point. Or maybe your monthly TMF QC check was not performed for the month of April as per the management plan, the end. There's no explanation surrounding the event. There's no root cause. There's no documentation of any due diligence, no explanation of what would or could have been done in the future to prevent such an incident. So in that case, it's poorly written, it lacks clarity, and renders the note to file pretty useless. And then, there's the more is better approach, which we touched on just a few minutes ago. Yeah, more is not always better in the case of note to files. It's not good. It's not good documentation practice. You don't want to use note to files for every little nuance that goes on in your trial. That often leads to repetition or redundancy, duplication. There's really no added value. And again, if you have too many note to files, it can suggest a bigger problem and perhaps open up a whole new can of worms with regards to your processes or lack of training. And an inspector will do a deeper dive into those things, or they could. They may look at your CAPAs or lack thereof, and then it can result in way more findings. And lastly, attempting to replace the irreplaceable, as you and I both know, Oliver, there's some things that you just can't replace. So for example, if a document was never filed in the TMF and therefore missing, a note to file stating that the document is missing and then filing it in place of that missing document really has no value. And that's not to be confused with a note to file that's being used as sort of a signpost. And Donatella, I'm going to get your feedback on this in a minute. Where you would normally find a specific document filed in its proper location, but instead you'll find a note to file explaining that that document is currently located in another repository outside of the TMF, maybe temporarily, perhaps, and this might be acceptable because you're providing the location of that document and why it's being filed in a location outside of the TMF. So I've seen this before in my past life, and it was acceptable. Donatella, have you seen this? And how would an inspector deal with that? Is it acceptable?
Yeah, sure. I mean, totally agree with you that when it's the case that the note to file is used to give additional information, and in this case is to give more detail about the location of a document, it makes sense. It makes sense to use it. And so it's also helpful for the inspector or the auditor to have it, because it's a sort of roadmap to understand where the document it is. And it's a requirement. I mean, according to ICGCP, we are required to have a record of the location of the document. So if for any reason that document is not in that particular section, zone, artifact of the trial master file, but maybe in another, location or for any reason, in that case, a note to file makes sense. I mean, it's really to add added value, added information to be able to reconstruct the story of the trial. So definitely, in that particular, let's say, background, makes a lot of sense to have the note to file.
Great, that's what I thought. Thank you.
And I think this brings up a really good point. And this was actually a question in the chat from Lorianne, which is, and I know that this is something that we typically recommend here, which, Lorianne asks, what are our thoughts on a note to file master list or a log? I know, Donatella, this is a recommendation that we typically go through. Do you want to maybe sort of dive into that for a second?
Yes, we are going to see even the note to file template, some slides in some slides, but definitely what we strongly recommend when we develop note to file process manager with our customer is to have a note to file log tracker. Call as you want, but definitely a sort of list where you have all the note to file written for that particular clinical trial. That will help you, not only you during your health check, during your oversight of your TMF, but also the inspector. So at the end, it's a sort of guidance that you have, and even to ensure more consistency in your trial, in your note to file process, to have a track, a log with all the note to file issue can be really, really helpful. The other, let's say, way to see a log is to ensure the consistency when you are a sponsor that also outsource the trial master file management to a CRO, because in that scenario you will have the note to file issue by the CRO plus the note to file issue by the sponsor. So two actors in the trial management that issue note to file. So the reconciliation and the alignment at the end of the trial must be done. And this is why, having a not-to-file log, not-to-file tracker will help you in doing that final reconciliation to ensure the quality of your trial master file.
It's funny, I just wanted to add, this master list, I've gone back and forth. I was a bit on the fence on it, and I saw comments sort of not exactly agreeing with me, but not seeing the full value of that master list. And I do get the value now, and I am leaning more toward having that master list now. So my mind has been changed, but in the past I thought it was kind of overkill, or it was redundant, because if you're using an eTMF, all your NOTA files are filed in there, and if you want to get a list of them, right, you can just filter for all your NOTA files and get a list, and there's your master list. But I understand that there's more information associated with those other metadata, let's say. So I do get the value of having that master list. Yeah.
Well, I think we have to remember that what we're trying to do here is tell a story, and if we feel like there are gaps in that story, a note to file is required to fill that gap. Why not expose that as obviously as possible to an inspector, because it's ultimately helping tell your story. When it comes to sort of the negative, I think a lot of people are thinking, well, I don't want to draw attention to all of the note to files I have. I think we've got to change our mindset a little bit and think a little bit more about how, pointing people in the right direction, pointing inspectors in the right direction. If we've got a solid process in place and we've got clear justification for why that note to file is in place, it shouldn't be an issue. If we're concerned about putting a note to file log or master list together, there's likely a deeper problem there, that you're lacking confidence in the notes to file process. And rather than avoiding the note to file log or the master list, try and focus a little bit more on defining that process a little bit better, so that you can improve how you manage note to files as a whole. So there's a ton of questions here, but I'd love, Donatella, let's talk a little bit about when notes to files can be useful. And we've touched on a lot of this stuff already, but just to sort of package it all together, what should we be doing when it comes to notes to file, and when we should be using them?
Yes, so Oliver, I really like your point, saying that TMF is the storyteller of the clinical trial. So definitely we need to have a complete story. So sometimes not to file can be a pieces of the puzzle of the story when the story, is incomplete. Sometimes, already said, if you use with the correct approach, with a robust process, the not to file, that not to file can fill the gap in your story. So in that case, yes, you are free and authorized to use not to file. Very important to document your due diligence, because not to file, you use not to file basically to avoid finding during inspection or audit, but sometimes it becomes the finding, because if it is not well written, it will be the finding of the inspection. So it's very, very important that what you try to underline, it's obvious that if you write a not to file, it means that you are not in compliance. But you have to show what you try to do to follow the requirement, to follow ICH GCP. So show the finding, show the issue, but also show what you did, try to solve it, try to mitigate. So document your due diligence, document your effort. This is what the inspector wants to see. They want to see not the issue. Obviously, if there is a not to file, there is an issue majority of the time. They want to see how you try to solve it. What were the action that you took, try to mitigate those issues and try to prevent that issue to be there again in the future. So this is what they want to see. If they see this, let's say, effort, this process of quality, because we are talking about quality in our clinical trial, that makes sense. So you can write a not to file. And then you can, last but not least, you can use a not to file to answer questions. Give you this example just to make you better understand. Again, we are TMF is the storyteller. When we are an inspector, we try to reconstruct the story to understand, the compliance with requirement, if the patient safety and the data integrity were ensured, and all the stuff. Obviously, if the story is not clear, I will start to do myself some questions. Let me give you this example. Years ago, I was one of the sections that you usually check more is the training certificate, where you verify that people have been trained on GCP, on the protocol, on the SOP, because it's important that to perform the job that are trained, obviously, on what they have to do. And for some, for some of the people of the training certificate, for example, one person has something like 6 different certificates of GCP training, and all the rest of the team were just like one training certificate. So apparently, in this case, you say, okay, more is better than nothing, it's more than 0, but why just one person has something like 6 GCP different training certificate and the rest of the team just 1? Maybe there is a rationale, maybe there is a good reason, or maybe it's just a fault in filling a document that is not needed. So you start to make some questions, and maybe there is a good rationale for that person to have lots of GCP certificate. So just write a note to file explaining that for that person was necessary more than one training because to issue in the management of the protocol procedure, or think about versioning. Investigator brochures need to be issued every year, but if there is no need to issue a new version because maybe there's no change in the content of the investigator brochure, you can decide as a sponsor not to issue a new version. So the question will be, okay, but per requirement, I need to have a version every year. Yes, but I write a note to file explaining that we decided internally not to issue a new version because there were no updates, there's nothing was changed. So in accordance with the competent authority, ethics committee, and blah, 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 we decided not to issue a new version. So there is a rationale. It is an exception. The question can come out, but there is a rationale, and you track this rationale into the note to file. So this is the right case when you can write a note to file. So to summarize, obviously a note to file needs to be well written. So it must be clear and accurate because it must reconstruct the story. It must answer some questions, some doubt. It must clarify. So it must be clear and accurate. Add an appropriate level of detail because again, I am the inspector. I didn't manage a clinical trial. I'm trying to reconstruct and link the dots. So I need to have the detail necessary to be able to understand the story. Don't abuse, as Kathy says. So use them not frequently, only when they are really necessary, when there are no other tool, no other document where you can capture that particular information. If it is already information, we just create a confusion in the inspector. And very, very important, ensure that note to file are timely. This is a principle in general of our trial master file, to upload, manage QC document in a timely manner. We are doing the story when we are performing clinical trial, so everything must be managed in a timely manner. Don't wait, the inspector or the end of the trial to write all the note to file just to fill the gaps and try to avoid finding. That is not the right approach. You should write a note to file for example, why you become aware of the issue, and that is when you perform your oversight, your health check, and the QC of your TMF. So don't wait, write them in a timely manner.
All right. Such a great explanation, I think, of when we should be thinking about notes to files and some of the common issues, right? I think we've talked a lot about when note to files go wrong. So let's talk about how we can start to think about the process a little bit more. Now, there's been a whole bunch of questions on what should a note to file look like? Are there, should we create a template for notes to file? I know that this is a big recommendation for us when we're working with customers, is to sort of standardize the process, and a best way to do that is to at least provide the best guidance when it comes to putting a template in place. So, when we know that we should write a note to file, when we've decided that we should write a note to file, what should our note to file typically look like, Donatella? When it comes to the content that should be included, it really needs to obviously have some detail because it's part of the story. What are some of the recommendations that you make, or some of the items that we typically put in our note to file templates?
So definitely, as you said, Oliver, it's very important to have a template. I mean, define the process, and defining the process, we recommend to develop a template to ensure consistency and to ensure the quality of the note to file management. More or less, a template obviously will be issued on a letterhead of the company. There will be some, let's say, reference to the protocol, to the study, maybe to the site, if it is site related the issue. So give obviously all the details and the reference of what you are writing. And more or less, I think that everyone is doing like that. But the most important thing is the content. So in the content, as already told you before, it's very, very important that you don't just mention and describe the issue that you are facing. You need to very, very detailed describe how you mitigate the issue, what you did, the corrective action, but also the preventive action for that issue, in the way that it's true that you didn't follow the requirement, so it's true that there is an issue, but the inspector will see that you did your best to avoid that issue in the future, and to avoid to prevent that issue recurring in other studies. So they want to see this root cause analysis of the issue, try to understand what is the source of the problem, and then try to identify the best CAPA that you can put in place for that problem. That is something that must be always there to file, to make the note to file a document with an added value for your story. And another thing that is quite challenging is the numbering of the note to file. And Katie, here I would like your experience as well, because by my experience, I always had to number the note to file. So apart from the date, obviously, the note to file as a number, a sequence number. But I'm seeing right now with some of our customers that is not used to number the note to file, which is really strange to me. And I want to hear if you have experienced something like that.
It's funny because, and I know we kind of touched on this ourselves a couple of days ago. When I had more involvement with note to files, more hands-on, we didn't number them. It wasn't part of our process, but this was a while ago, and maybe the process, we weren't as aware as we are now, but all the issues you can happen with note to files. And after I had heard your explanation for numbering, it makes a lot of sense. I'm still learning myself, despite the number of years I spent in TMF, it's always evolving. Things are always changing. There's always improvements to be made, improvements in processes. And, and now that we're most people or most organizations are dealing with eTMFs as opposed to paper, though there are still some, as we know. This also kind of brings forth new processes and as well. So yeah, it was kind of news to me when you told me that. And when I heard the explanation and the rationale, I was like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I'm on board.
I'm
happy to hear that, because I was feeling like an alien, like I always number the note to file. Why people don't?
I get it. It's a small detail, but I think it makes a big impact in terms of tracking your note to files and making sure you have they're complete. And I just wanted to say about these templates. I know, Oliver, you mentioned at the beginning how, once you know you need a note to file, you can go to your template. But I was thinking in the past, templates I've seen, they were kind of almost used to help out to determine if you need a note to file, because it could almost be used as a checklist, that ensuring that you have all the necessary components of a complete note to file that, that tells the story you need to tell. And maybe if you're missing some of these major components, maybe that's an indication that maybe this is a scenario that doesn't necessarily require a note to file. So in its basic, benefit, you can use it as a checklist almost, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that, I mean, we see that example in other documents that we create and file in the TMF, right? Where we have, checklists and guidance and things like that. Why not include them in your note to file template as well, right? And I think that's an important part of it. I think the other thing that's really interesting, especially when it comes to the numbering, is, okay, if we're not numbering our notes to file, and if we feel like it's important to have a note to file log, which is obviously our recommendation, how do you build that log if you don't number your notes to file, right? Because you got to be able to make sure that you connect the dots in those areas, and how do you sort of connect them to everything else that you're doing in the TMS? So I think numbering is probably one of those things where some people say, oh, I don't think we need to number them. And some that will say yes. It's sort of a two camps kind of category. But I think, if we're thinking about how to build a really robust process, starting with a template, starting with a standard naming convention or numbering convention for these notes to files, including a checklist, like you said, Kathy, and how you should be completing a notes to file, but also when you should and when you shouldn't, helps just ensure that whatever is being filed as a note to file is as close as what it needs to be when it comes to filing it. So I think that's just a really great recommendation. Without a template, and I know that Kathy, you and I have spoken about this before, there's some really interesting bad examples of notes to file when you're not using a template. Have you anything come to mind on your end, Kathy, in terms of notes to file that you've seen when a template hasn't being used, and what are the issues that you find there?
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it earlier about, there'll be a note to file, and, I mean, this was a while ago. I'm hoping things have improved. But, the one sentence, signature missing. This such and such a process was not performed. The end, again, no explanation surrounding the event, no root cause analysis, no, attempt to mitigate, no due diligence, no, indicating how this could be prevented in the future. It's just, there it is, deal with it. I know that's my due diligence, and hopefully, an inspector will accept this. Not so much.
And that's ultimately what I think creates the fear of note to files, and probably the fear of creating like a log or a master list to show note to files or to flag note to files to an inspector, is that if all of your note to files are written like that, where it's one or two sentences and it hasn't really been standardized, of course, that's going to present a huge issue, right? So if we standardize the process, provide a template, guidance on what should be done within the note to file itself, drawing attention, directing an inspector more clearly to those note to files shouldn't be a risk at that point, right?
Yeah.
So
process.
There's a whole bunch of questions around signing notes to files. Now, this is really up to you guys. I think when it comes to signing notes to file, there are pros and cons to signing them. If we think about when we want to sign a note to file and some of the pros to it, of course, signing a note to file is going to help you establish a clear audit trail. It's going to show traceability of what's happened. It's also going to enable you to provide additional evidence of the event or the decision. And it may help to ensure accountability of the information contained in the note. It's just an additional verification. Some might say, well, there's no requirement to sign a note to file. There's nothing in the regulation that says that there's a note that we need to sign these note to file. So there are definitely some downsides if you decide to doing that. It may create unnecessary administrative burden. If it's not necessary, why do it? It could raise additional questions about the authenticity of the note if the signature isn't done correctly. Or like Donatella's point earlier, the signature process isn't well defined. And so you have some wet ink and then you have some electronic signatures depending on the process that's been defined. And then, if it's not required by certain regulatory authorities, does that create inconsistencies in your process that could warrant questions from an inspector. So Donatella, Kathy, the big question here is, what do we recommend? What do you recommend when it comes to notes to file? Would you look at signing them, or would you say it's not required? Or is it really up to the organization that's building that process themselves?
I'd say, well, in my experience, we usually did sign them. It's not necessarily required, no. And I think the big takeaway here is maybe just consistency, whether you decide to sign or not to sign. And as you went through the different pros and cons, there are both. And I guess, as an organization, you would decide, what you're more comfortable with considering those pros and cons. But yeah, I think consistency is really key here. And to make sure you have this, if you decide to sign your note to file, sign them all, and get that consistency, and of course put that process in place, because that'll ensure the consistency. Donatella, do you have more to add there?
Yeah, so totally agree with you, Kathy, on the importance of consistency, because it's something that inspector really take care. So, and we must ensure consistency because it's a sign of quality in our TMF management. If I can bring this example, we use not to sign and not to file. And basically not to file were issue, I'm talking about the sponsor level, by the CTA, who was performing the quality check and, verifying that something was missing, or something was not in place, or something that must be more detailed, that this person was writing the note to file. Obviously, the content must be clear, that in the content must be clear the accountability. So maybe it's the CTA who is writing the note to file, but the accountability of the document is of the data management, of the data manager, for example. So I think it's very important, the principle of the accountability, because as you said, Kathy, is not a regulatory requirement. There's no regulation that say that you have to sign a note to file, so it depends on you, on your company process. And here we have some pros and cons, but definitely the accountability of the content of the note to file, that is a requirement. So it must be very clear who is, let's say, the document owner. And if the document owner is not the one who is writing the note to file for processes, for internal processes, at least the document owner must be aware. So it happens to me that sometimes we ask the document owner to sign the note to file, just to confirm that he was aware of the issue. So the issue was found out and written down by the CTA, but the document owner was aware. So, because again, TMF is a big story. There are a lot of stakeholders and document owner, but very often not everyone is managing directly the trial master file, the process of the trial master file. So if not, let's say, the direct person that writing on to file, just be aware for the principle of accountability.
So can I ask a question? Let's just say, for example, something happens at the site and it involves a process or a task that, let's say, the site coordinator was involved in, or something she did or didn't do, whatever the non-compliance was, and he or she writes this note to file and they decide to sign it. So he or she will sign it. Is it necessary to have the PI sign as well, since they're accountable for all the site activities and staff?
I would say yes, because he is the one who, according to regulation, he is responsible for the entire, study team and for the entire compliance of the protocol. So he is the one who is responsible for the entire clinical trial conduction at site level. So yes, I would recommend yes.
Yeah, me too.
All right. I feel like that's going to ignite a fire in the chat. I can just feel it coming.
Good.
All right, so let's move on. Yeah, we want that fire. So let's move on. We've talked a lot about inspections already throughout, but of course there is a potential regulatory impact when it comes to note to files. And we've talked about, if we don't manage the process or define the process correctly, it can pose a much larger risk. But it's not to say that regulators or inspectors will look at note to files immediately as a bad thing. Right. So if there is a note to file process in place and it's well documented and there's consistency, you know, what are the inspectors ultimately looking to see? I guess I gave away some of that already, but what are some of the expectations when it comes to notes to file from an inspector that's reviewing the TMF? Donatella, maybe I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, in my experience, I want to say that inspectors don't expect the perfection for a clinical trial. I mean, they come and they will find something anyway, even if you are the most good, you know, clinical trial management team in the world, but they will find something, maybe not critical, maybe not major, but they will find something. There is no expectation of perfection. So not to file are expected for an auditor. It's part of the game, let's say. At the same time, for the inspector not to file, as already explained at the beginning, are a sort of roadmap, because, you know, the inspector come, they don't have lots of time. They have a very big goal of identifying the quality, identify if there is an issue in the clinical trial management. So in the big amount of a trial master file documentation, which we all know that it's a big amount of document, where to look at, where to focus my attention if I am an inspector. Not to file can guide me. Not to file can tell me, look at that site, because there are lots of not to file. Look at that artifact, look at that zone of the trial master file, because it's full of not to file. Look at this particular site, because there was a not to file regarding a protocol deviation. So not to file are sort of guidance and roadmap for inspectors. So are guidance for us that need to you know, be able to reconcile the story, but also for inspectors. So they can be very helpful. At the same time, if you're not using properly this not to file, as we seen before, they can be the finding itself. Here is a warning letter. I think it was written for Sanofi, that noted that 89 memos were generated after a monitoring visit. So the point is not, let's say, the 89 memos, but the point is that they've been waiting for, you know, the trial to be ending to write all this not to file to explain some issue, rather than qualifying and train the staff, train the site, try to correct immediately the issue. So why you have been waiting for 89 memos before doing something? So this is, let's say, the finding. And another example, if I remember, it was a warning letter to Johnson & Johnson, and the finding was a not to file that was explaining that a site was selected despite it has a story of uncompliance, of GCP non-compliance. So obviously, if a site has some GCP issue, it's not your first choice. I think that we all agree in that. The point is that sometimes for the study design, I've been through such a situation. You can't avoid to take a particular site because maybe it's the only one with the patient, it's the only one with some particular surgery or some particular, you know, IP delivering procedure. So sometimes you must take a site, and maybe sometimes this site is not the best in the world. So the finding was related not to the choice of selecting a site not in compliance. The finding was related to the fact that there was no rationale, you know, in choosing that site. Okay, you are obliged to choose the site for these good reasons that are, you know, a sort of benefit for the protocol. Give me the rationale. Explain the not to file, why, despite all the issue, you have decided to go with this site, because there are a robust rationale, and nobody will tell you. I think that if it is for the benefit of the protocol, so for the benefit of the patient, nobody will tell you anything. And again, maybe there are lots of GCP issues, but you can do your effort as a sponsor and, you know, train the site, give some resources. So that is not the problem. But you can't just write a note to file saying that despite the GCP issue, the site was selected. What does it mean? Nothing. So that was the finding. Another very tricky point is for not to file during inspection is be careful, because I found out in some warning letter that the finding was related to the fact that during the interview, people were saying the contrary of the content of the note to file. So if you write a note to file, be aware of the content and be aligned on the content while you are doing the interview with the inspector, because you know, the content must match. Otherwise, it will be a finding. So there are a lot of aspects to be considered when it comes to inspection. But definitely remember that not to file is a finding unless you don't, you know, explain the root cause analysis that you perform and the CAPA plan that you put in place.
This TMF stuff's not easy, eh, Donatella and Kathy?
But it's a lot of fun, Oliver.
It is. It really is. It gets the juices flowing. Is it just me?
All right. So let's cap this off with, I guess, a bit of a summary on what we've kind of all touched on a little bit today. But this is kind of the process that we recommend, or the blueprint, let's say, to putting in place your TMF strategy. Donatella, maybe do you want to sort of take us through step by step, sort of fairly briefly? Of course, we're going to provide the information to the guests after today, but what are some of the things that you want to sort of call out here in this 5-step process to putting in place a note to file strategy?
Yeah, sure. We went through this process right last year with a customer. Now we are in step 4, I would say. But definitely, I would like to tell you what we did. We at ETMF services with this customer. So basically, we perform an health check of their TMF of a study, and we find out that not to file was abused. I mean, we find out lots of not to file. With no consistency, apparently with no rules, bad written, so a mess. To summarize, it was really a mess. And so we came out with our report, I'll check report, that there was a big issue in not to file management, and that can be a source of finding during inspection. So we suggest to improve the process. So identify the need, the gap when performing our health check on the not to file, on the trial master file, and we define a process with them. So we develop a not to file template, first of all, because I didn't have it. We establish a clear process for how to write the not to file, how to review, how to approve it, and how to fill it, because remember that in the according to the TMF reference model, you can fill the not to file in a dedicated section that are available in each zone of the TMF reference model, or you can also link the not to file in the artifact of the document. For example, if let's say that the oversight plan is missing, you can write a not to file giving the explanation and fill the not to file in the oversight artifact and not in the not to file section of that zone of the TMF. So we define also this kind of process for them. We define the owner of the not to file and who were in charge of signing it in case or review it. And we define also the relationship with the CRO, because it is a sponsor that is working mainly with CRO outsourcing. So we define how to manage not to file when the CRO is involved. We wrote a working instruction for them, but we put also the not to file in their ETMF plan template, because in our, we've got a template for ETMF plan, and there is a specific paragraph that we use to define the process for not to file. So we combine, let's say, this kind of approach, implemented this information in their template already available. So we make, let's say, the process more complete from a compliance point of view and more clear also for the CRO as well. We did the training because obviously once we have set up the new process, you need people to be trained, to be aligned on that process. So we organize internal training. And now we are in the step 4, so we are implementing the process. This is a very important step, the most interesting one, I would say, because we defined the theory. Now they are going through the practice of putting in place the process that we have developed with them. And last but not least, we are going to review the process to verify if there is anything that must be adjusted and updated, because obviously for them it's the new time that got a process, so the process must be tested, let's say. So by the end of the year, we're going to meet again the team and verify if the process is good or need to be adjusted, maybe according to some particular situation and so on. So these are, I would say, definitely the main step when we guide our customer in a development of such a process.
Amazing. So there's the roadmap, guys. That's the real overview of what you need to do to put in place a note to file strategy and the process that we go through for helping our customers do so. If you have any questions and you want to speak directly to any of us, you can always reach out to us on LinkedIn, or what I would recommend is that to join the State of TMF community group on LinkedIn. It has over 1,000 TMF professionals. The slide deck from today's video presentation will be available in the community group exclusively. That's the only way that you're going to be able to get access to the content. But we also share other exclusive content from Montreal. It's there to network and grow your knowledge, and of course, ask questions to the community. So head over to LinkedIn and search for the State of TMF community. Obviously, I want to thank everybody for joining live today. If you've listening to this podcast on your commute to work or while you're in the office, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with another episode next week. Donatella, Kathy, this has been so much fun, and I'm excited for the next session in 2 weeks' time. Just as a note for anybody that's heading down to the TMF Summit next week, Montreal will be there, so we hope to see you in Florida. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the State of TMF, a live podcast brought to you by Montreal, the leaders in clinical, regulatory, and quality systems for scaling life science organizations. Hit the subscribe button, download the episode, view the episode on YouTube, and follow us on LinkedIn for more great content coming from Montreal soon. See you next time.